This is the Fantasy Football Fellowship Podcast, the show that unpacks fantasy, faith, and life. I'm Bryce Johnson with Harrison Zuckerberg, and we are your fantasy coaches here to encourage you and help you win while finding meaning and purpose throughout the fantasy season. We won't always be right, but we hope we'll be convincing as we provide fantasy advice and biblical encouragement. I'm coming to you from the Unpacking It Ministry studio in Charlotte, North Carolina, and this is the final episode of 2023. That's right. We will try our best to prepare you for the playoffs. Hopefully you've been listening all season long, going back to the summer, and your teams are positioned for a playoff run. Well, we're sending you off. So the next couple of weeks, it's up to you. We won't be walking alongside of you, but we will be back in the new year and excited to kind of wrap up the fantasy season with one final breakout as well. And then we'll get ready for the off season and all that. So it has been a great season here on the podcast. Thanks to all of our loyal listeners. We really appreciate you. Would love to hear from you. How did the season turn out for you? And where were we right? Where were you right, wrong? Let us know. It would be great to hear from you. Bryce at fantasyfootballfellowship.com. And I'll just say off the bat, before I jump into the breakout, I am pleased to share that in my 5 kind of normal leagues, I'm in the playoffs in 4 out of the 5. So pretty good. Finished second in 2 leagues. Actually, I won the Unpacking It regular season in my division, so that's exciting. But it's going to be tough. Going to be tough, and we will talk about that in just a little bit. But Justin Herbert is my quarterback, and so not feeling good about that. But anyway, we'll talk about that. So overall, though, a very positive fantasy season outside of my one kind of bummer of a season in one league. But anyway, I rallied, I hung in there. But we'll see what kind of playoff run I can make, but for you as well as a listener. So we'll have some fun talking waiver wire today. Also, we've got a special Christmas segment. How do fantasy players relate to Christmas movies? We will do that shortly. And of course, we'll do fantasy shenanigans. And unfortunately, today, all the shenanigans are about injured players. So we will discuss in just a bit. But first, each week we do a breakout where we take a fantasy concept related to the Bible, relate it to life. And today I want to talking about fantasy football. And if you're like me, you love playing fantasy football, but you also love talking about fantasy football. And yes, I talk about it on the podcast, but I talk about it off the air. I talk about it with friends. I talk about it with family members. If I'm calling a friend, we're talking fantasy. I'll talk to strangers about fantasy football. If I'm at, a party or a get together or lunch, I'm talking fantasy football because I love it. It's fun. I enjoy it. I'm passionate about it. And what's interesting though, is along the way, sometimes you're probably, you realize this too. When you talk to other fantasy managers, you have a common bond. You relate. Oh yeah, Monday Night Football. Oh man, yeah, I had Tyreek Hill. Oh yeah, I had him too. So you can relate to that. But when we talk about fantasy football, oftentimes we will bump into people that don't play. Oh, it's horrible, right? I mean, what kind of people are these? What kind of people don't play fantasy football? But there are people like that. And so those conversations end up being interesting because what do we have to do? We have to explain what fantasy football is. And then we tell them why we're passionate about fantasy football. Here's why I play. Here's why it's been so important in my life for the last 20 years. I've been a fantasy manager. I'm in my 20th season. And so I love telling people, like, here's how it works. And here's how I build relationships with other people by playing fantasy football. And we stay connected all season long. And then, of course, I love fantasy football because of what it allows me to do to lead to conversations about faith and life. And so I try to convince and educate and explain and help non-fantasy people, participants, understand what fantasy football is really all about. Because oftentimes people don't really understand fantasy football. And that's why they don't play. Or they have a misconception of what it is or what it's about. And they're hesitant to commit. And so then I tell them, hey, here's why it's worth committing. And so this whole concept of talking about fantasy football is at the end of those conversations, right? You invite them to play. Oh, you should try it. You should play. You got to join a league because sometimes people have never been invited to play. They've never had a league to join, and so you got to introduce them or welcome them into your league if there's an opportunity for that. And so as we think about how much we love talking about fantasy football, it relates to the conversations that we have or sometimes don't have when it comes to talking about Jesus. When it comes to talking about our faith. Are we passionate about Jesus? And if we are, and if we love Jesus, then we talk about him, right? We share with other people the joy that we've experienced by following Jesus, by being a part of a league, so to speak, a church, by being a part of church, by being a part of the family of God, the fantasy community. No, the community of faith. We've been a part of it for however many years we've been on this journey with Jesus. That's our story. And so we share that story, our testimony with other people. And sometimes it's great. We talk to other believers and we yeah, oh man, God's doing this in my life. And oh yeah, I was reading this in Matthew, and God was really, speaking to me through that. And so we have those great conversations. Well, then sometimes when we talk to people that are non-believers, they're hesitant. They don't really know what Jesus is all about or who he is. And so there's some misconceptions that they have. And so for us as followers of Jesus, that's an opportunity to share our faith and then share the truth of the gospel, to share the truth of God's word with people and invite them to church or invite them, more importantly, to follow Jesus, to receive his love, his grace, his forgiveness, the salvation that he offers us through faith in his death and resurrection. And so those are the conversations that matter. And especially this time of year, those conversations, there's a better chance to have those conversations. But are we willing to do it or are we hesitant? Because going back to the fantasy conversation, sometimes we're like, this guy doesn't like fantasy. I'm not going to talk about fantasy with him. But if we really love fantasy, we want him to experience fantasy, we're going to tell him all about it. Dude, here's how great fantasy is. Same thing. There are people in our lives that we interact with, sometimes even strangers, and we go, they probably don't want to hear about Jesus, but they need it. They need him. They need to hear us. They need to hear the conversation. And so we come at it with our passion and love, and that's captivating, right? It's contagious. Like, wow, this guy really loves Jesus. And then we don't do it in a weird way or, you hit people over the head with a Bible. No. In a loving way. Great with grace and understanding and that kind of thing. So here are a couple verses to encourage us today. Romans 10:14 and 15 says, but how can they call on him to save them unless they believe in him? And how can they believe in him if they have never heard about him? And how can they hear about him unless someone tells them? And how will anyone go and tell them without being sent? That is why the scriptures say, how beautiful are the feet of messengers who bring good news. So let's be those messengers, not just for fantasy football. No, the good news, the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's what we want to share. That's what we want to explain. That's what we want to invite people into, the life of following Jesus. And now, but also eternal life, inviting them into eternal life. And so explaining to them, hey, this changes everything. Jesus changed our perspective on life. And just like fantasy changes your perspective on watching football and keeping up with the NFL, Jesus changes everything. The joy we experience, the peace we experience, all that is available. But we got to tell people. We got to let them know. And so 1 Peter 3:15, this is the Amplified. It says, but in your hearts, set Christ apart as holy, acknowledging him, giving him first place in your lives as Lord. Always be ready to give a logical defense to anyone who asks you to account for the hope and confident assurance elicited by faith that is within you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. So let's be those ambassadors. Let's be the feet of Jesus and the messengers, that share the good news. So that's the message today as we wrap up this calendar year for the Fantasy Football Fellowship podcast, and I hope that that's encouraging to you. If you're a follower of Jesus, and if you're not, I hope that you hear my passion. This is why I do this show. That's why I do this ministry. I'm passionate about Jesus. He's changed my life. I know he can change yours. So I want to tell you about it. I am passionate about fantasy football, and I want you to have a great season. I want you to win. I want to teach you what I've learned by playing 20 years of fantasy football. So that's the motivation. That's the passion there. So there you go. That's today's breakout. And I hope that is encouraging to you. It's fun talking fantasy, but it's even more important to talk about the good news. So let's say hello to Harrison as we continue to talk fantasy football today. And, final episode of the season, final episode of the regular season, we'll say, of 2023. How are you feeling heading into the playoffs?
I'm feeling pretty good heading into the playoffs. Of my teams that did make the playoffs this year, I didn't deal with too many injuries, and luckily those teams are in pretty good shape. However, the teams that did not make the playoffs were the ones that were hit by injuries really hard, so it's kind of bittersweet. I don't have to worry about making waiver wire claims anymore on those teams. I can just forget about it and only worry about the teams that actually have a chance of winning this year.
Absolutely. And I know for me, I look at my rosters and I've had good season. I said I finished second. The problem is you have to figure out, okay, is this a championship caliber roster? Now things will end up changing over the next couple of weeks, so you got to hang in there. But for me, I went all in on Justin Herbert. And for the most part, I didn't really carry backups. In one league, thankfully, I picked up Gardner Minshew this past week to at least give me something, because the waiver wire is bleak when it comes to quarterbacks. But Herbert being injured with this finger, especially on the short week Thursday, there's no way he's playing this week. And we're waiting on the news on how long he's actually going to be out. But I'm not really counting on him. And so now it's scrambling. Can I put together the best roster possible to make a run? And we can't give up because other teams will face injuries. Monday Night Football, Tyreek Hill, he gets injured. He does come back. But those types of things are going to continue to happen over the next couple of weeks. So it's just hanging in there. But as far as the injuries go from this past weekend affecting playoff rosters, you got to think about Tyreek. You got to think about Justin Jefferson, Geno Smith, Nico Collins, who crushes me, CJ Stroud also with the concussion, Josh Jacobs banged up, Alexander Madison. Whew. It is a lot of shenanigans.
Fantasy shenanigans.
The injuries, Harrison, what do you make of them?
I mean, it's just terrible. We've talked about this every single week, and I wish there was a week where we could not start off the show by talking about, star QBs, franchise QBs, fantasy stars, high draft picks getting injured, but that is what's happened every single week. And what this just makes me think of is I feel like going into this season, last year, if you had Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, or Patrick Mahomes, you had a huge advantage because those guys were scoring so many more points than the rest of the QB field. But going into this season, both you and I and a lot of people were thinking, okay, maybe Joe Burrow, Justin Herbert, Tua, Lamar, some of these mid-round guys could make their way up into that elite level with the Hurts. Maybe we see a regression from Mahomes. Maybe it's not valuable to take a QB in the second round of the draft this year. It is still just as valuable because even though those guys have had down years, they're the only ones still standing on a football field throwing the ball every Sunday. All of those mid-round guys, Herbert, Lawrence, Justin Fields, Joe Burrow, they're not even, some of them are playing football now, but for a lot of the season, they were not playing football. So once again, getting the Josh Allens, even though, you try to outsmart people and be like, oh, well, maybe if I don't get the number one QB, but I could get the number two later on, just go get Josh Allen. Josh Allen is great every single year. There is no strategy that, goes against or is better than just drafting Jalen Hurts or Josh Allen or Patrick Mahomes.
Gosh, that's a great point, because I was going to bring up how, some of the other shenanigans from this past weekend, it's all the random quarterback performances. But the problem is these are so unpredictable. So can we really trust our fantasy playoff hopes on these guys. It's unlikely, but it's been a very wild quarterback situation. So I agree with your point. Yeah, you want those three guys. Now, Mahomes is the most concerning because once again, he didn't break 15 points. But maybe the motivation from this last loss changes everything and they get things going. We'll see. But how about these random performances? Desmond Ridder. Are you kidding me? 26 fantasy points. Jacob Browning, who we bought into, 24 fantasy points. Matthew Stafford, 23. Bailey Zappi, 22. Mitch Trubisky, 22. And they weren't even good. I don't know how he scored 22. He ran the ball. So these guys, Flacco, 21. Flacco was throwing the ball all over the field. He actually looked pretty good. So are these the guys that we can trust in the playoffs? I think it just comes down to, are we forced to? And of these guys, you know who I'm actually leaning toward is Flacco. You know why? Because they've got weapons around them and they are like competing in the play. Like they want to win their division, make it. I know the Ravens are ahead of them, but they got a shot there, get into the playoffs. You can trust them. Bailey Zappi in New England, I'm not trusting them. Not with my fantasy. I'm not putting those guys in my starting lineup. Are you kidding me? Jacob Browning, they're competing. So I'm kind of leaning toward him. Desmond Ridder, he's been out there all season. He's unreliable. Don't buy the one hit wonder on him. So anyway, your thoughts on approaching the QB position?
Yeah, I like Stafford. If Stafford's on waivers right now, because he's been doing this for, the last few weeks. I think he's like 10 touchdowns in the last 3 weeks. He's been throwing it all over the field. And again, the Rams, a team who was terrible at the beginning of this season, is now in the wild card picture in the NFC. The team that they have is not really a team with young guys that you're going to tear down. It's older guys like Stafford, like Cooper Kupp, Aaron Donald on defense. Like they're going to try to compete, and that's just the way Sean McVay is. So I think we've seen it from Stafford in years past. We've seen some games this year. If you need a guy, I think he's the one you go out and get because, he could be throwing for 400 yards and 4 touchdowns in a game because their defense is awful and they need to be playing in shootouts to have a chance to make the playoffs.
Yeah, Cooper Kupp looked much better. So that's encouraging. I don't think people that drafted Cooper Kupp in the first round are going to the playoffs. That would be my guess. If you overcame the rest of your draft, good for you. But I have a feeling some of those teams that got you off to a slow start, and even midway through the season, even after he came back. What about some of these other big kind of running back, wide receiver performances, somewhat out of the blue? So Ezekiel Elliott, 27 points, led running backs this week. Well, maybe Mostert did, but he was right up there, top 3. Unbelievable. And again, I'm not trusting the Patriots. So it was a nice game. It was a Thursday night game against the Steelers. They surprisingly got the win. I'm still not trusting him at this stage of his career. However, big performance from Chase Brown, 19.5 fantasy points in Cincinnati. I am buying the hype. I think I said it last week, but I've got him in my one league that I've got an opportunity to keep him for next year. This guy's the future of the Bengals. I wondered about it a few weeks ago. I don't think any of these backups are any good because Chase Brown was injured. He wasn't getting out there. He finally is out on the field, and he looks good. He wears number 30. He looks like Austin Eckler. He's now kind of the second coming of Austin Eckler. Let's go. And then Rico Dowdle had a nice complimentary game with Tony Pollard. He's someone that could be involved down the stretch. So I am kind of keeping an eye on him. I wouldn't put him in my starting lineup just yet, but definitely want him on your roster. And then Drake London had a big game this week, 29 points for him. OBJ with 20. Any other kind of performances that you're evaluating with playoffs in mind?
Yeah, I think the Chase Brown one is interesting because we were worried about the Bengals' production on offense with Jake Browning coming in, and then how is that going to affect T. Higgins, Jamar Chase, Joe Mixon, Chase Brown? And they've been even better than they were with Burrow, surprisingly, especially the running backs in Brown and Mixon. They've developed a really nice 1-2 punch there. I've been all in on Mixon, and that has paid off the last couple weeks. But I think both of them are guys that you could start pretty confidently in fantasy, right? Like Joe Mixon's not going away for the rest of this season. So if you have him, I would not stress about him. But that does not mean that you can't also go all in on Chase Brown because it's pretty clear they're trying to manufacture, plays and touches and get him on the field in a similar way that we've seen the Dolphins do with Devon Achane this year, because they're both explosive guys. And even though Achane is not taken over as the main starter there, we know sooner or later, probably next year, he is going to be the starter, just like Chase Brown is probably going to be the starter next year. So those are valuable fantasy guys to have towards the end of the season. Similar thing in Tennessee, we saw last night on Monday Night Football, Derrick Henry and Tajay Spears. Tajay Spears looks fantastic. Now, Derrick Henry's not going to go away anytime soon. He's at least got a couple more games in him. But, Tajay Spears is someone as well. He is worth a flex start, definitely having on your roster, because the future is now. It is coming up soon.
So if week 17 is your championship game and you get there, Tajay Spears, he could be a league winner right there. So great performance yesterday. Man, he just looks good out there. So, but the Titans keep winning. They're in games, and that was a big win Monday night for them. So we'll see how the next couple of weeks look like. But I think by then they'll probably shut down Henry and Spears will get in there. All right. So we've got a quick show today. But I want to make sure that we get to a fun segment. We started this last year. Hopefully you liked our Thanksgiving edition, our Thanksgiving segment. Today is our Christmas movie segment. What fantasy players remind us of a Christmas movie? All right. I love Christmas movies, and we will begin with my favorite Christmas movie and probably my favorite player in the NFL. So Santa Claus. It delivers every week, it delivers every year. It's always good. It's always reliable. And so who, when healthy, delivers every week? Who can you rely on? Every time you watch him, you're pleased. Just like every time you watch Santa Claus, you're pleased. Who is it for you? You tell us who it is.
It's got to be Christian McCaffrey. He has
Absolutely.
been probably one of the most exceptional fantasy players this season that I can remember in recent history, just because he's never busted any week. Over 13 points every single week. You've never been disappointed with having him in your lineup. But it's not just that he's consistently, 13, 15 points. He's averaging 24 points per game. The RB1, definitely the best fantasy player this season, I would say. Tyreek Hill was up there, but after the fluke game last night, I'd give the edge to McCaffrey now. Again, everyone wanted to go away from running backs. Oh, well, do you take Jefferson first, then Jamar Chase, then Hill? When you have the best running back in the NFL, in the best, running scheme in San Francisco, we should not have missed this, that he was going to have a historic season. He's on pace for, 2,000 yards and 20 touchdowns. I can't even remember the last time that was done, probably like LaDainian Tomlinson, early 2000s. Maybe it's happened since there. But, man, he is unbelievable, delivers every week.
And so does Santa Claus. Such a great movie. Tim Allen. I love all three of them, but the first one is still the best. All right. Speaking of the first one, Home Alone. All right. Home Alone is really good, but there are some down parts. It gets a little slow at times. Macaulay Culkin's walking around, Kevin McAllister. It's a little bit slow, but ultimately it's really good. And so who was that this year in fantasy?
I think it's got to be Bijan Robinson, because there's been a lot of times this year where we don't really know what's going on with Bijan Robinson, because he's nowhere to be found. There's not really any action. Like, wait, I don't really know what the plot line is. Like, what are we trying to do? I thought this was going one way. Now it's going another. But in the end, the talent wins out with Bijan. The excitement's there. It ends with a bang. He's been great pretty much 3 of the last 4 weeks, coming on strong, and is reminding you why you took him in the first round of drafts.
Absolutely. So we follow that up with Home Alone 2. I prefer Home Alone 2. It is such an adventure. Now, it came in with some hype. It was following up, Home Alone, and it lived up to expectations, even better than the original. And so who was that this year? It's CeeDee Lamb. He was solid last year. He has taken another level this year. He has been elite. CeeDee Lamb lighting it up for fantasy managers, lighting it up for the Cowboys. Huge win against the Eagles. The next one, Christmas with the Cranks. I find this to be the most underrated. And I've got to admit, going into this season, I wrote this guy off. This is really good. It's kind of like Christmas with the Cranks. Can Tim Allen really have another Christmas movie? It's Rachaad White. He's fourth in running back average. He's been very healthy, tons of production, tons of volume, and he's been awesome. So most underrated, Rachaad White. The next one, Christmas Vacation. All right, Harrison, I find Christmas Vacation always funny, always reliable. And this is one of my go-tos every year. I got to watch it. So I got to watch it every year. Who is that player that you got to have on your roster every year?
Yeah, I mentioned it earlier, but Josh Allen, once again, the QB1 in fantasy points so far through the season. And it's been an adventure. We were talking in the middle of the year about, oh, is the Bills offense done? You know, a little bit of a roller coaster ride, but don't worry about it. Josh Allen has figured it out. Still the number one QB in fantasy, still the number one, maybe not overall asset, but one of the top assets you want to have on your team because you can rely on him every single week instead of having to go to the waiver wire and get, Bailey Zappi. You throw Christmas Vacation on, everyone's going to love it. You put Josh Allen on your team, you're going to have a good season and have a great time. So I would go with Josh Allen for that one.
No doubt about it. All right, Jingle All the Way. It's very stressful, yet very enjoyable. It's fun, it's hilarious, but it's intense. And so who is that this year? It's Jahmyr Gibbs. Because it's intense at times because you're wondering, Lions, why won't you give him the ball? Why won't you allow him to get into the end zone? Why don't you throw more passes to him? Why you keep handing it off to David Montgomery? So it stresses you out as a Gibbs manager. But ultimately, he still scores a ton of points. He's been a great fantasy player this year. I think he's only going to get better. He's going to help you win leagues. So I still love it. Still love Jingle All the Way. All right, I actually watched The Grinch with my daughter this week. This past weekend. Now, The Grinch stole Christmas. So who is the Grinch in fantasy? Who stole your season? For me, it was Nick Chubb. Who was it for you?
For me, it was Nick Chubb as well, but also Justin Jefferson, because at least with Nick Chubb, you could drop him, pick up Jerome Ford, move on. Justin Jefferson, you had this hope that he was going to come back at some point, and then they kept adding one more week every single week. Oh, well, next week he's going to come back. And then he comes back this week, and he gets injured again. So he has just been a complete letdown because you haven't been able to drop him, but you haven't been able to start him. You're just in this weird position with keeping him on your team.
He is the Grinch. Absolutely. All right, last one. Elf. You'd think it'd be absurd. You see the trailer. It's like, oh, this is ridiculous. There's no way this is going to be good. It's silly, but it totally surprises you. It's heartwarming. It's hilarious. So many good one-liners. Will Ferrell at his best. So in fantasy, who reminds you of Elf?
For me, the Elf this year is definitely Raheem Mostert. 31 years old. We're talking about, Derrick Henry's falling off a cliff at 29. Raheem Mostert's even older than him. He's never been healthy in his career. Bounced around the league, former special teams player, hasn't really been productive, but finds his home, finds his people in Miami, and he is the RB2 in fantasy so far this year. Only had 14 career rushing touchdowns going into this season. And after last night, he now has 16 in just this year alone. He's going to hit 1,000 yards for the first time ever in his career. Crazy story about, unexpected heroes, especially with all the other weapons on that offense. Raheem Mostert is the one who has broken out of nowhere and has had probably the most valuable fantasy season of any player, because unlike Christian McCaffrey or unlike CeeDee Lamb, you weren't taking him in the first round. He was maybe going undrafted, or you were taking him in the 10th, 12th, 15th round of drafts, and he has probably been the best player on your team this year.
There you go. I love it. Christmas movies reminding us of fantasy players. Great job, Harrison. Always a fun segment each year. So that was great. All right. We've got to get out of here, but before we do, we have to ask the question.
Come on, seriously, who is that?
And we got to take a look at the waiver wire. And I think it's a tight end. It's a tight end heavy segment this week. And so we begin with Davis Allen, rookie, Rams tight end. What do we think? One touchdown, 50 yards, 4 catches.
Come on, are you going to tell me who that is?
I'd say go pick him up. I like it. He's intriguing. I think he's worth a flyer. On the flip side, in Seattle, you've got Colby Parkinson.
Come on, seriously, who is that?
10.8 fantasy points. My brother's name's Colby, but I'm still not picking up Colby Parkinson. And then lastly, tight end. How many tight ends do the Colts have? Seriously.
Come on, seriously, who is that?
Will Mallory, 9.6 fantasy points, 5 catches, 46 yards.
Are you going to tell me who that is?
I have no idea who Will Mallory is, but I'm not going to pick him up. And the Giants have 15 wide receivers. The Colts have 15 tight ends. And it's hard to know who to get, who you want. But give me one guy on the waiver wire, and then we're out of here.
Yeah, so two guys for me. The first one is Ty Chandler. Should already have been picked up, but if someone dropped him with Madison coming back, go get him again. Season high in touches last week. Madison's injured. Going towards the playoffs, you could have a starting running back there. And then Zamir White in Las Vegas. Josh Jacobs had a knee injury late in that game. They play on Thursday night. Jacobs is not going to be ready to, have that quick of a turnaround with a knee injury. Zamir White is someone you want to get and probably start in fantasy this week with Jacobs out. And, it's hard to start these running backs off waivers in the playoffs, especially when you have produced you all year long. But my advice is, we see it every single year. If a running back has a RB1 role on a team late in the season due to injury, if they are the starter in real life, start them on your fantasy team because they are going to produce just off of volume. We saw that with Ezekiel Elliott this week.
Right.
He's washed, but still has 27 points in fantasy purely off of volume. If any running back goes down and you can grab the next guy, doesn't matter how bad the team is that they're on, doesn't matter if they're all unproven, they are going to score. We saw it again with, Clyde Edwards-Helaire and Jerick McKinnon for Kansas City. If they're getting touches, they should be on your fantasy team.
There you go. Chase Brown's my guy. I want to get him on the Bengals, running back. So, Harrison, great job. We will talk to you in the new year. Hopefully, we're talking about some fantasy championships, and we'll look back at the season kind of overall and have some fun on that episode. So until then, hope you have a wonderful Christmas. Happy New Year. Thanks to all of our loyal people listening to this podcast each week. Thanks for participating in Fantasy Football Fellowship all season long. It's been fun. Enjoy the playoffs. Hopefully you made it. I'm Bryce. I'm a fantasy manager who follows Jesus. I believe in the good news that he died on the cross for my sin. He was resurrected, and through faith, I've been saved by his grace. I hope that is true for you as well. And I hope you'll join me as we live life as fantasy managers who follow Jesus together. Have a great rest of your day. Have a wonderful Christmas. And we'll talk to you next time right here on the Fantasy Football Fellowship Podcast.